Hi, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about 10 nonfiction books written by Black authors that I would recommend for Black History Month. The first book I want to talk about is The Autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. This book tells the incredible story of Malcolm X, starting with his childhood in Lansing, Michigan, then exploring his time hustling in the streets of Harlem. We then follow Malcolm X and experience his time in prison, during which he reads the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and converts to Islam. After coming out of jail, we follow Malcolm X's political activism in America. We also see his break with Elijah Muhammad and the Muslim Brotherhood, and finally we see Malcolm X's spiritual journey at the end of his life. I think that this autobiography does a very good job of humanizing Malcolm X. My favorite part of this autobiography were Malcolm X's years in jail, where he gives the readers a political crash course discussing pivotal texts that raise his political consciousness. I also found the foreword written by Alex Haley to be really interesting. Alex Haley was a very well-known journalist and writer who is most well known for writing Roots, and the foreword discusses Haley's experience working with Malcolm X over a period of 2 years to put together this book. The second book I want to talk about is Revolutionary Suicide by Huey Newton. Newton was one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party. This book follows Newton from his childhood in Oakland, California, to his struggles with the system, to the creation and growth of the Black Panther Party, and to his solitary confinement in jail. In the book's introduction, written by his wife, Frederick Newton, she said that this autobiography would serve the same function as Malcolm X's autobiography. The book would humanize Huey Newton and explain the birth of his political consciousness. Personally, one aspect I really enjoyed about this book was reading about all of the texts that influenced Huey Newton and the Black Panther Party. He was clearly a very well-read and knowledgeable person. In the first few pages of this book alone, he quotes Che Guevara, Emile Durkheim's Study of Suicide, and Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I think this book is a really important read for people who want to understand more about the ideas and concepts that shaped the creation of the Black Panther Party, which is an organization that I think is very much misunderstood. The next book I want to talk about is an autobiography, and this is written by Angela Davis. This book accounts Angela Davis's early years, describing her journey from her childhood in Birmingham, Alabama, her political activity in a New York high school, her work with the U.S. Communist Party, the Black Panther Party, and with the Soledad Brothers, her work as faculty at the philosophy department at UCLA, and her experience being on the FBI's most wanted fugitive list. Angela Davis herself refers to this book as a political autobiography, a book that emphasized the people, events, and forces that propelled her to where she was. I really enjoyed reading about Angela Davis's journey to political consciousness, particularly her journey exploring philosophical texts and how philosophy shaped her activism. Angela Davis has written a plethora of books, and an honorable mention is her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle: Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundation of a Movement. While this month obviously the focus is on Black history, I think it's also important to educate ourselves and continue to fight against oppression all around the world. And part of that includes supporting the Palestinians and their cause. The next book I want to talk about is When They Call You a Terrorist. This is a memoir by one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Therese Khan Cullors. What's really amazing about this memoir is that it explains a lot of the systemic issues in American society, such as the school-to-prison pipeline, while also including personal stories and experiences of the author. One aspect of this memoir that was really eye-opening was the author's discussion about her brother Monty, who suffers from mental health issues and has had numerous interactions with the police. It was a really clear example of intersectionality and the fact that for some Black people, issues such as class and disability can create even greater forms of oppression and discrimination. The next book I want to talk about is The Skin We're In, and this is by Desmond Cole. Desmond Cole is an award-winning writer, journalist, and activist in Toronto. In this book, Desmond Cole chronicles 1 year, 2017, in the fight against racism in Canada. 2017 was a year in Canada where there were calls for tighter borders as a number of Black refugees were crossing from America into Manitoba, a year in which there were numerous protests resisting the celebration of Canada's 150th birthday and protests in support of Indigenous peoples' fight for their land and water. And 2017 was a year in which police across Canada rallied around an officer accused of murder. I think this book is very helpful in order to understand more about racism in Canada. There are 2 chapters in this book that I just wanted to highlight in this video. One chapter is called Justice for Abdirahman. Abdirahman was a Somali-Canadian man who suffered from mental health issues. In this chapter, Desmond Cole looks at the murder of Abdirahman in an altercation with Ottawa police in July 2016. Another chapter that really stood out for me was Here for Defonte. This chapter speaks of the horrific assault of Defonte Miller, a young black man who was violently assaulted by a police officer in December 2016 in Whitby, Ontario, which is a town about an hour outside of Toronto. While Defonte survived the attack, the police officer blinded him in one eye. These are just a few stories about police brutality in Canada, which I feel are often not mentioned. I would say this book is mandatory reading, especially for Canadians who want to learn more about racism in Canada. The next book I want to talk about is The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. This book is written by Michelle Alexander, who is a civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar. In this book, Michelle Alexander argues that the racial caste system of Jim Crow laws, which relegated Black Americans to become second-class citizens, has not ended. Rather, it has been redesigned. This is due to mass incarceration in America. What Michelle Alexander outlines in her book is that in reality, the reason why people of color, particularly Black people, are so overly represented in the prison population is due to the actual laws and policies in themselves. A prime example is crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine. Powdered cocaine is a drug that's more frequently used by white Americans and has a much lesser penalty than crack cocaine, which is a drug that's more frequently used by African Americans. Michelle Alexander sets out in her book is that these sorts of drug laws result in a disproportionate number of Black Americans ending up in jail for drug-related crimes. I would also highly recommend the 2012 documentary, The House I Live In. There is a really interesting section of this documentary which looks at how drug laws have historically been associated with race. For example, opium was a drug that was used by a number of white housewives, and it was only criminalized when Chinese Americans in the West started using it. Similarly, weed was frequently used by white Americans and was only criminalized when it became popular with Mexican Americans in the 1930s. Going back to Michelle Alexander's book, the impact of mass incarceration is that there is now a large part of the Black population who are discriminated against because they are criminals. This can result in a legal denial of employment, housing, and public benefits, which was similar to what happened under the Jim Crow laws. Michelle Alexander argues that in order for there to be racial justice in America, the issue of mass incarceration has to be seriously looked at. Now I have 2 books that I would recommend as more accessible reads. The first book I want to talk about is So You Want to Talk About Race. The book deals with issues including privilege, police brutality, intersectionality, microaggressions, cultural appropriation, the Black Lives Matter movement, the model minority myth, and the N-word. I would highly recommend this book for anyone who is looking to become an ally, or a book for a person of color who wants a text that will help them to understand how to have difficult conversations with people in their lives about racism. On a similar vein is the book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, which is by Reni Eddo-Lodge. The book deals with a number of issues including Black history in the UK, white privilege, the fallacy of meritocracy, the whitewashing of feminism, and the link between class and race. So I just wanted to quickly mention 2 honorable mentions, which is Black Skin, White Mask and The Wretched of the Earth. Both of these books are by Frantz Fanon. I have been reading these books but haven't finished either of them, so I can't quite give them full recommendations. But I think they're very helpful in terms of understanding the impact of colonialism on Black people, especially the Black psyche. And I know The Wretched of the Earth is a book that inspired a lot of revolutionaries in America. I did want to include a slave narrative, and for that I have the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery. He was the son of a Black woman and a white slave owner. His autobiography accounts the horrors of his years as a slave and talks about his journey living through slavery, the Civil War, the end of slavery, and the beginning of segregation. What really stood out to me in this book was Douglass's desire to read. While a slave, he secretly taught himself how to read and write, and this was a crime that was punishable by death. He talked about the freedom and liberation that comes along with being able to read and write. And what really stood out to me is the need for education when it comes to liberation. I think this book is really important in terms of understanding the trauma of slavery. First of all, when reading this book, you can't help but feel such empathy towards Frederick Douglass and the life that he had to lead. Additionally, what's standing out to me more is the impact of this sort of thing long term. What impact does it have on a generation of people who have grown up without family ties, with babies taken out of their mother's arms? In this book, Douglass talks about the fact that when his mother died, it was very similar to a stranger passing away. And what are the implications long term of generations of people not having these family ties? This leads me into the final book I want to talk about, which is Sisters of the Yam by Bell Hooks. I am a huge fan of Bell Hooks and her work, and this book is very useful for Black women. Hooks takes issue with a lot of other self-help books, which she says focus too much on the individual actions that women can take without bringing attention to the structural issues within society. By focusing too much on the individual and not focusing on the structural issues, it makes women think that they have more of a chance to change their lives just from their own will and action, when in reality there are probably going to be some structural issues which will prevent them from fully being able to realize their actual potential and have a fully developed, healthy level of self-esteem. Just having that idea and understanding that I can work on my own self-esteem and work to become a better, healthier person, but there are still lots of oppressive forces in society that are going to prevent me from being fully self-actualized, was very helpful for me when it came to working to develop my own level of self-esteem, and it showed me that it really is important to fight against all forms of oppression in order for us to actually be fully self-actualized. In this book, Bell Hooks looks at a number of issues that are facing Black women, including addiction, beauty standards, stress, work, love, and talks about ways in which we can develop healthy self-esteem despite a lot of these issues. One thing that really stood out to me in this book was how Hooks talked about the legacy of slavery and how that really has had a very detrimental impact when it comes to, let's say, relationships within Black Americans. This is also a very easy and accessible work by Bell Hooks, and so if you're really interested in learning more about Bell Hooks and are not sure where to start, I would definitely recommend this book. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that this has been helpful and you have walked away with information about some nonfiction books that could be really good reads for Black History Month. I'm planning to do a video where I talk about fiction books that I would recommend for Black History Month, so when that gets posted, I will include the link to that in the description box. Let me know in the comments if there are any books that you would recommend. I know that someone has recommended Elaine Brown's Autobiography, and so that has definitely been added to a book that I want to read. I also have a very extensive TBR of books that I'm reading for Black History Month, so let me know in the comments if people want me to share that. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and if you like this sort of content, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.